we're back in Judges. You may be happy about that. You may not. I didn't take a vote, so here we are. We took a little break for the summer in the Psalms, but we're going to pick up back in the book of Judges, and it's an interesting book. It's a hard book because it deals with a time in the life of God's people and the history of the nation of Israel specifically, where things were not going well. You know, God had made for himself a people, and we started several years ago back in the book of Genesis, and we've been working our way through. God made for himself a people by calling a man, Abram, and his wife, Sarai, and calling them to follow him and entering into covenant with them, that through him he would make a people, through him he would create a nation that would experience the blessing of God, that would be a people that belonged to God, and ultimately through them, all the other peoples, all the other nations would be blessed. And God kept his word. God always keeps his word. And so Abram and Sarai, even though they were not able to conceive and have children, even though they made some rash, really foolish mistakes early on, God kept his word. They did conceive. They had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. That the family grew into a nation. They grew into a nation in Egypt, where they found themselves enslaved to the nation of Egypt and Pharaoh. They called out to the God of Abraham. He remembered his covenant, his promise, and he brought them out of slavery. He redeemed them from Egypt and Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt and Pharaoh. He rescued them and delivered them with his mighty hand. He brought them out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. He brought them to the mountain where he entered into a formal covenant with them at Sinai. He became their God. They became his people in an official covenantal way. He gave them the law. He gave them instructions on the creation of the tabernacle so that he would dwell in their midst. And then he led them to and towards the land of promise. Now, nothing's ever easy, so instead of immediately going in and taking over the land, they lost faith, they broke trust, they decided not to listen to God, not to trust in him. They allowed fear to override their faith, and so that entire generation had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they died off, and then God led his people into the promised land. And we walked through the book of Joshua last year, where God, under Joshua's leadership, leads and directs the people to come into the land of promise and bring judgment upon the enemies of God and receive the land that God had given to his people. So it's got its ups and its downs, but overall, it's a really good season and time in the nation of Israel. And then we get into the book of Judges. And the book of Judges is describing the time after Joshua, after the people entered into the land, after the conquest, the time that they inhabit the land as God's people without a leader. There's no centralized figure. They had Abraham, they had Isaac, they had Jacob, they had Joseph, they had Moses and Aaron, they had Joshua and Caleb. Now they're in a time and a season where the tribes are in their inheritances, they're spread out, they're disconnected, and there is no centralized leadership in the land. And so the question is, how will God's people function without that kind of a leader? And the answer that we find in the book of Judges is not very well. So the time period is described over and over again in the book of Judges itself, that in that time there was no king in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, we live in a culture that says that's a good thing. You should do what's right in your own eyes. You know your own truth. You can define yourself. You can do your own thing. It's not a good thing When Scripture says, in that time there was no king in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It did not go well for them. And so in the book of Judges, we get this cycle that happens over and over again. At least 6 times, we get it described very specifically. And here's how the cycle goes. The people do, and the text always, it calls it the evil. They do the evil. Like, they don't just do a couple of bad things. They do the evil. And the evil is rejecting God as God to worship and serve other gods. And so as time goes, as they settle into the land, as they receive the blessings and the promises of God, their hearts begin to turn away from God and be drawn to worship and to serve other gods. And so the people do the evil, and God, because of the terms of the covenant, does exactly what he said he would do, and he brings discipline upon them. He brings judgment upon them. Listen, we have the freedom to choose our own course. We don't get to choose the consequences of our course. So there's consequences to our choices. Our choices matter. Israel learns this over and over again. They choose not to worship, not to serve Yahweh, and they go after the other gods, and they receive the consequences of that choice. And God raises up other powers, other kings. He gives them what they ask for. Oh, you want to serve other gods? You want to serve other peoples? Let's try it out. And so the people suffer. Because while God loves us, while God cares for us, while God wants to provide for us, the other gods don't. They want to consume, they want to control, they want to destroy, they bring death. And so Israel would suffer, and then they would do what suffering people do naturally. They would cry out. God, because he is God, because he is compassionate, because he is able to relent, because he is able to forgive, God would raise up a deliverer, a judge. It's where the book gets its name, the book of the judges, the book of the deliverers. Now, these don't think robes and bench and gavel. These are not legal. Think warrior, think deliverer, think the one that casts off the oppressors. These judges are raised up by God to save Israel, and they do. And we get moments of rest, just breath. 7 years, 18 years, 40 years of rest. And then the cycle begins all over again. But it doesn't just repeat. It repeats and gets worse. It degenerates. So we see as we walk through the book of Judges, like the first few judges are awesome. The first judge, Othniel, he's related to Caleb. There's just nothing you can say bad about him. But the second judge, we get to Ehud. He's my favorite because he's a lefty. Got some lefties here this morning, amen. Right? Come on now. Ehud, the left-handed judge, he slays the morbidly obese King Eglon of Moab. But he's got some issues. Like, he's mostly good, but, you know, we start to get some questionable things about Ehud. And then we got to Shamgar. Shamgar, I call him the one-verse judge. That's all we get. We got one verse about him, right? And what we learn about Shamgar in that one verse is that he's not even an Israelite. He's a foreign pagan warrior devoted to an Egyptian goddess of battle, and God chooses to use him to rescue Israel, which is an ironic insult to the people of Israel. Then we get to Barak. And Barak is absolutely unwilling to be a judge. He doesn't even want to do it, and he ends up being overshadowed by Deborah, and God uses him, but he doesn't even want it, and he just disappears. So we have this cycle, and then we get to Gideon, and that's where we ended off a few weeks ago. Gideon. And Gideon doesn't start off well. Gideon is fearful. Gideon is weak. Gideon will obey God up to a certain point, a point that agrees with him. Gideon tests the Lord. Gideon has some deep connections to Baal and to the worship of other gods. Gideon is messed up, but God chooses Gideon. And God uses Gideon. God clothes Gideon with the Spirit. One of the things I love about Gideon is that it's really clear that the accomplishments of Gideon were not by or about Gideon. There was God. God clothed him with the Spirit. And when Gideon called the peoples rallied against the Midianites, the sons of the east. These are nomadic, camel-riding, tent-dwelling raiders. Right? They would sweep in from the vast deserts during the time of the harvest. And they would come and raid the harvest and destroy Israel. And Israel was forced, if you remember, to flee and hide in the caves. And God called Gideon, and Gideon put out a call for Israel to stand up, and the troops came. And if you remember, they responded so well that there were too many. God's like, no, if you fight with that many people, you're going to take credit for it. So he comes up with this little plan, and based on how they drink, God whittles the army down to 300. And then God comes up with a battle plan that didn't make really much sense from a human perspective. He says, I want you to fight with a trumpet in one hand and a jar with a light in the other. And it works, because he's God. Right? Like, that's how that works. So now it's more complicated than that. They're attacking from the top of the mountain. They come in the night. And what happens, what God does, as the 300 men come and they blow their horns and they throw down the jars and lights begin to break out in the night, the entire army is thrown into confusion. And they don't have to stab anybody, because the Midianites start stabbing each other. And then they flee, and the force is broken. And they take off running back to the desert, out of the land of Israel. All right? We're all caught up. Are you guys ready? Okay, here we go. Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So, the army has broken, and we're talking a significant force. The text says there's 120,000 swordsmen in that original force that has now been broken and scattered. And so Gideon, with his 300, he's not content with just defeating them and then taking off. Gideon's now going to pursue them. So he crosses the Jordan. He's got 300 men. They're exhausted. They're tired. They fought during the night. Now they're running and chasing. And it says he said to the men of Succoth. So he crosses the river. They come to this town of Succoth, this area. It's this is where Jacob wrestled with the man all night long that turned out to be God. So that's the area where this is taking place. And he comes to the people there, and they're Israelites. This is in the territory of Gad. Okay, now it's in the Transjordan. It's east of the Jordan, but these are the eastern tribes. So he comes to them, and he says, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zeva and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. The kings of Midian. So that seems like a reasonable and good request, right? Like, and up till this point, when Gideon has put out a request, Israel has responded. But this time, it goes different. It says, the officials of Succoth said, are the hands of Zeva and Zalmunna already in your hand that we should give bread to your army? Which is an insulting way of saying no. Right? So they say, you haven't defeated them yet. Why should we give you bread? And I suppose here's the logic. If we support you and you end up losing, then we're going to be in trouble for supporting you. So good luck and bye-bye. Okay? So they refuse. And Gideon said, well then, when Yahweh has given Ziva and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. He throws a temper tantrum. Now, it might be understandable, right? But we're starting to get a glimpse again into the character and nature of Gideon that's not great. He's petty, he's mean-spirited. When he doesn't get his way, he throws a fit, and he goes to violence. He responds in anger. There's a temptation sometimes when we read these stories in the Bible that we gotta make these guys the heroes all the time. There's only one hero all the time in the Bible, right? That's Jesus. Some of these stories are written. They're all written for our instruction. They're all written for our encouragement. They're all written for our good. But there's no reason for us to look at this and try to justify Gideon's behavior. So he says, oh, you're not going to give this to me? When I come back, I'm going to whoop you. Okay? And then he goes to the next town, Penuel, and he spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him just as the men of Succoth had answered. And so he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. I don't know how he said that with a straight face. When I come in peace, I'm going to destroy your walls. Right? So, early on in the story of Gideon, we see God giving him instructions, clearly telling him what to do, how to do it, how to go about things. Now, after the battle has been won, after the Midianites have been defeated, we don't see God telling Gideon anything. In fact, in this entire narrative that we're going to look at this morning, God doesn't show up except on the lips of Gideon, and that's incredibly problematic, as we'll see as we continue. So what we're seeing here now is not Gideon doing what God has asked him to do. We see Gideon doing his own thing. So, I don't know, some of you like maps. That's where they start, up in the valley of Jezreel, near Mount Tabor. They come down south, they cross the Jordan, they go up to Succoth, they go to Penuel, and now he's going to continue down into the desert, like going after the Midianites as they think they're in a place of safety. Now, the reaction of these two towns, Succoth and Penuel, to flat out say no. No, we're not going to help our fellow Israelites. We're not going to give you bread. We're not going to support you. We're not going to participate in this battle against the Midianites. Like, it forces you to kind of take a step back because it's so different than what we've seen in the narrative so far. Up to this point, Gideon has been clothed with the Spirit. And when he speaks, when he calls out, when he asks for Israel to step up, they have stepped up. But now, here he is asking these Israelites to step up, and they refuse him. I think if you're in the story and you're paying attention to the text, it forces you, at least at some level, to say, has the Spirit been removed from Gideon? Is he acting in the Lord's will, or is he acting in his will? I think it becomes clear as we walk through this text that we've moved from the place where Gideon is being used by Yahweh to the place where Gideon is trying to use Yahweh for his own ends. So it continues. It says, now Ziva and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. Men who drew the sword, which I think the author is just, there's so much irony in the text in the Hebrew that it's hard to see in the English. That Hebrew phrase there, men who drew the sword, think about how the battle went. Like the 120,000 men who drew the sword and killed each other with it. Right? Like, so you remember as Gideon, and they're blowing the trumpets and they're throwing the jars. Do you remember what they shout out, a sword for Yahweh and a sword for Gideon, which is problematic. We're seeing that problematic reality begin to unfold itself. Gideon is trying to elevate himself. Gideon is trying to use Yahweh's call and Yahweh's blessing for his own ends. So Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogbeha and attacked the army, for all the army felt secure. The author of Judges doesn't give us any information about this battle. Okay, it just says, these guys have run a long way. They've suffered a humiliating defeat. They get to a place where they feel secure. They're back to the desert. They're back to the place. They don't expect in any way that Gideon is going to follow them. So Gideon and his 300 defeat the 15,000. We don't get any details about how they did it, but it's not hard to imagine how a smaller force can defeat a much larger force when that larger force is not paying attention, is exhausted, feels secure, and does not pay attention. So we don't get the details. We just know Gideon went up, by the way, attacked the army, and Zeva and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zeva and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. So now he's done it. He's taken the two kings, Zeva and Zalmunna. Zeva means sacrifice. Zalmunna means shade denied, which is really, when you think about what Succoth and Penuel did, they denied them refreshment. They denied them refuge and strength. So anyway, he takes these two kings and he begins to make his way back to Israel. But he doesn't take a direct route home. He's going to go back the way he came. And so it says he captured a young man of Succoth. Just think about that phrase. Gideon has been leading these 300 to fight against the Midianites. Now he's fighting against his own people. He goes and he captures one of the men of Succoth, and he questioned him, right? I don't know what kind of waterboarding or whatever it is that he used, but he questioned him about the state and the people of Succoth. And he wrote down for him the officials and the elders of Succoth, 77 men. And so he's questioned. He gives up the information that Gideon is after. And it says, and he came to the men of Succoth and said, behold, Zeva and Zalmunna. Remember, because when he came to them, they said, are they in your hands? And he's like, so now he comes back and he's like, ta-da, right? He's like, here they are, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zeva and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. Which is a really nice way of saying. So what it literally says in the Hebrew is he took them out and he threshed them. Remember the threshing floor, right? You take grain and you beat it against the stone, and then you take that and you throw it out. So he takes them out, and with thorns and with thistles, he threshes them. He beats them mercilessly. And then he broke down the power of Penuel, which is what he had said he would do. But he goes a whole nother step, and it says, and there he killed the men of the city. So we can try to do all sorts of theological and mental gymnastics to try to justify and make this into a good thing, but just the common sense reading of this, you look at this and go, this doesn't seem good or right. Like, he seems out of control. He was raised up to rescue Israel, and now he's killing Israel. Then he turns to Ziva and Zalmunna. And he enters into this conversation with them. It's a strange conversation. It actually follows an ancient literary technique of chivalry, a conversation before death. He asks them this strange question. It's in some ways an unanswerable question. He says to them, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" Where are the men you killed at Tabor? Well, they're dead, right? Like, it's a strange question, right? Where are the men you killed at Tabor? And if you're in the story, you're like, what are you even talking about? Like, Tabor hasn't really been mentioned except its vicinity to where the Midianites were encamped. They were near Mount Tabor when they were gathered together. That's where they were defeated. They were near there, but we don't have any information about what he's talking about. So we're going to get a little bit of new information about what happened when they had invaded. He says, "Where are the men that you killed at Tabor?" And they answered, "Just as you are, were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." This is a weird response. He says, where are they? And they go, "Well, we can't answer that, but we're going to tell you this. They all looked like you. Mighty, strong, powerful, sons of a king. They looked just like you." It's almost a boast, right? Like, you've defeated us, but we defeated them first. And then he said to them, "They were my brothers, the very sons of my mother." So now we got a little more background information into Gideon. Like, we didn't get this when Gideon was called. We knew he was the youngest of his father. We knew that he had older brothers. What we didn't know is that his older brothers, when the Midianites had come in, had been up in that area of Tabor, and they had been killed by the Midianites. And so what we're clued into now is that this is a personal vendetta for vengeance. Gideon's not trying now to rescue Israel, to redeem Israel, to serve Yahweh. He wants revenge for the murder of his brothers. And then he says this, "As Yahweh lives, if you had left them alive, if you'd saved them alive, I would not kill you." Such a strange statement. Like, if things had been different, then I would be different. Like, no duh. Right? Like, but you see what he's doing? As Yahweh lives. Oh, now, this isn't about me. This is not my choice. I'm going to bring God into this. As Yahweh lives, if you would have left them alone, I would leave you alone. But now, because you killed them, well, I gotta do something. It's deflection. I call it the blame it on God syndrome. I'm really good at it. I wish I wasn't. You're really good at it too, whether you recognize it or not. We love to use God as a justification or a rationalization at some level for what we want to do. This is not something those outside of the church do. This is something only those inside the church do. Those outside the church don't care what God has asked us to do, or they just go their own way. We know that we're supposed to serve God. We know that we're supposed to obey and be faithful to Him. And so when we want to go our own way, we come up with really clever and manufactured ways to justify our behavior in the name of the Lord. That's why there's so many jerks for Jesus. Right? Doing hateful, mean-spirited, petty, vile, angry, defiling things in the name of the Lord. As if by claiming God's name and attaching God's name to our actions, it removes any guilt or any consequences for us. That's what he's doing here. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise up and kill them. That's good dad parenting moment right there. We haven't met Jether yet. Jether's a young boy. The text is going to say this. He's still a young man. He's a young boy. He's not a warrior. And so he turns to his young son, and here's the bound captive kings, and he says, hey, kill him. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. So Gideon's supposed to be the hero of this narrative at some level, right? And he doesn't start well, but he kind of gets some stuff together in the middle of the story, and you're like, okay, maybe Gideon's going to be okay. And then here we are at the end, and it's like, our heart is not for Gideon at this point. Our heart is for his young son. It's for the people, the men of Penuel that he just butchered. And then Ziva and Zalmunna respond, and they say, rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. So they're mocking him. Quit trying to get out of this. Quit trying to deflect as the Lord lives, having your son kill us. If you're going to do it, do it. Own it. Claim it. If you've got the strength, do it. So Gideon arose and killed Ziva and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. And you think, well, that's a weird detail to throw in. It is, but we'll talk about it next week. All right? Yeah, to come back. Okay. So as we will see next week, this is kind of the conclusion of Gideon's role as judge. The Midianites are defeated, and Israel will experience in that cycle, once again, a season of peace for a little while. But man, it ends with a sour note, doesn't it? It's actually going to get worse next week. But it's brutal. It's harsh. Gideon's acting in a selfish, personal, vengeful, angry, bitter way, and claiming to do it in the name of Yahweh, of God. You know, Gideon's vow, as Yahweh lives, if you would let them live, I would let you live, is a fundamental breaking of the third commandment. I think the third commandment of all the commandments is probably the most misunderstood. The third commandment we find in Exodus 20, verse 7. It says, you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And probably most of us have grown up with an explanation of this is a commandment against swearing. Don't have a potty mouth, right? Don't swear, but especially don't use the swear words that invoke or involve the name of God. And there is a tangential connection between that kind of cursing and language and this commandment, but that's not what this commandment is about at all. To take the name of the Lord in vain is to presume to know the will of God when God has not revealed that will to you. To take the name of the Lord in vain is to attach God's name to your actions, to your decisions, to your life outside of God telling you to do or be those things. Are you with me here? Do you understand that? Like when Gideon says, "As Yahweh lives, I would let you live, but now I got to kill you." It's a deflection. It's taking our choices, our decisions, our actions, and trying to stamp God's name onto them as if that will give validation or justification to what it is that we're doing. It's not about cursing directly. It's about claiming God as the reason or justification for our actions. And this is a huge temptation. It's like, this is not abstract. I see myself do it all the time. I see all y'all do it all the time. This is what we do. It's very easy in a political season to start attaching God's name to the party or the candidate that we like. Drawing lines that God hasn't necessarily drawn. Maybe he has drawn them, but how has he revealed that? To say, oh, vote this way and you'll have God's blessing. Vote this way and you won't. That may or may not be true, but for us to declare it, right? Like for us to decide, I think this is what, so I'm going to attach God's name to this. And then if you disagree with me and go against me, you're not going against me, you're going against God. Do you feel what I'm saying here this morning? It's a real temptation. It's not just political. We do it in our families. We do it in so many ways. We take God's name, we attach it to ourselves, and then use it as a badge of justification. We confuse God's blessing in one area of our life as being more than what it is. We take the things that God has done, and instead of giving him the glory and credit for it, we take that glory and credit for ourselves, and in our pride, we then think that we can determine what it is that God should do or what we should do in God's name. It is the highest form of pride and hubris to attach God's name to our choices and our actions. It's that fundamental thing, and I say this a lot. It's that move from being used by God for his purposes to trying to use God for our purposes. You know, Gideon's not the only guy in the Bible that had a challenge with this. Probably the most well-known, and maybe my favorite, is Peter. Peter had a Gideon moment. You know, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's him, that's the favorite way Jesus had of describing himself, the Son of Man, it's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is not the teaching of Jesus that Peter or any of the others wanted to hear. They wanted to hear the good stuff. They wanted to hear that. Now Jesus is going around and he's very clear. In fact, the next verse says, he said this plainly. Not in parables, not in mysterious, not symbolic, not imagery. He's very clear. Here's what's going to happen. Gonna go to Jerusalem. Gonna get killed. Gonna rise again. And they're like, I'm not sure that's what we signed up for. That's not how we think you should be. That's not how the Messiah should act. That's not what we think. And so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. What a moment. And like before you get all judgy and self-righteous and superior and go, what an idiot. I would never do that. Y'all, You've done that. Like every time you start praying, I'm like, God, why are you doing this? Every time we start to doubt God's goodness, God's activity, God's judgment, God's wisdom, we're pulling him aside and going, hey, that's not the way you're supposed to be, God. Come on now. Let me tell you how to be God. I've got some really, really good ideas. Like some of you got PowerPoints. You know what I mean? Like we got. Peter's like, stop it, Jesus. Stop saying you're going to die. Don't like it. Don't want to hear it. Not down for it. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, the adversary. Get behind me. Listen to what he says. For you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. That's what the third commandment's all about. Using the Lord's name in vain is doing the things of man and trying to attach God's name to it. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Which is so amazing in the context. Because if you go read Mark chapter 8, and right before this, like right before Jesus started teaching about his death and resurrection, he said to the disciples, who do people say that I am? And they're like, and Peter goes, you're the Messiah. You're the promised one. You're God made flesh. You're the one we've all been waiting for. And in the next paragraph, he's going, hey, you're not doing it right. It's unbelievable. And I mention that so that you understand just how easy it is. Like, Peter gets a pretty good attaboy when he says, you are the Christ. You are the anointed one, the Son of God. And Jesus is like, wow, flesh and blood didn't give that to you. God gave that to you. He's like, yeah, God's talking to me. Right? God, I got, you know Peter's looking at James and John going, huh, got it right. You know what I mean? Like, you know that. Didn't hear you say anything, Judas. Right? Like Peter's like, God's talking to me. I know stuff. And the very next breath, he's rebuking Jesus because he thinks he knows how Jesus should be Jesus better than Jesus does. Do you see how easy it is? Peter's not an idiot. Peter's not spiritually dead or deaf. Like, Peter actually hears from God. Peter actually knows God, and he's still able to be deceived and go this way. The point of this story is not for us to go, wow, Peter really blew it. The point of this is to go, oh, Lord, I don't want to do that. Like, I want to hear from Jesus, but I don't want to hear that rebuke. Especially that one, get behind me, adversary. I'd like to be on God's side. We spend so much of our time and energy trying to get God to be on our side. When the invitation of Jesus is, hey, come get on God's side. Jesus continues. He says, calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he then says to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. This idea that God is something that we can use to achieve or acquire the things that we desire, that God is a vessel or a tool that can be used or manipulated by us to get what we think we know is good and right and true and beautiful and necessary, is the exact opposite of what Jesus actually offered. Jesus doesn't say, hey, use me. Jesus says, like, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to die to yourself. You have to deny yourself. I'm not here I'm not here to serve your agenda. I'm here so that you can once again serve God's agenda. You want to come after me? You got to deny yourself. Die to yourself and follow. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world, but forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? The temptation, the decision to try to use God for the accomplishment of our vision, of our dream, of our agenda, even if you could get it to work, at the end of the day, what would you have? But yourself. Here's my prayer from this story of Gideon. Lord, save us from ourselves. Lord, save us from ourselves. I not only need to be saved from my bad intentions, I got to be saved from my good intentions. Lord, save me from myself. I am my own worst enemy. Lord, I've tried to tell you how to be God so many times. It doesn't work out well for me. I don't want to define you anymore. I want you to define me. I don't want to use you, God. I want you to use me. Lord, save us from ourselves. In a nutshell, that's the story of the entire book of Judges. Right? So here's the reality. God has made Israel a people that are supposed to be the means by which God rescues and redeems all people. So what happens when the rescuer needs to be saved? Right? Israel needs to be rescued. So what does God do? He raises up some judges, some redeemers. And they become just as broken as the people they're supposed. All of this is to point us to the reality with man, at the end of the day, this is going to be impossible. This is why Jesus is so good and beautiful. He is alone the sinless one. He is the Redeemer that doesn't need to be redeemed. He's the rescuer that doesn't need to be rescued, right? Like Jesus is the one that we can count on. Jesus doesn't violate the third commandment. Jesus goes into the garden, says, hey, if there's another way, but not my will, may yours be done. This is why Jesus is so good, so beautiful, so trustworthy. Because he is able to save us from ourselves. Church, stop trying to use Jesus. Start asking to be used by him. I know the prosperity gospel. I know so much of what is being taught and preached and written about. Stop trying to use Jesus for your selfish ends. And allow Jesus to rescue you, to redeem you, and to use you in his will, not in yours. Amen? And amen.